Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you're well. I'm going to be talking to you today about well-being and stress and the DBA and life, because wherever we are, whether we are a supervisor, whether we are a DBA student, whether we are here in a different capacity, we will all have different experiences of stress and well-being. And I want to tell you a little bit about my background in this topic and how I've reached this point of sharing this information with you, and I hope that it will be a very useful. I want to make it quite practical. We don't have too much time, we've got 45 minutes, so I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of the topic, and then we can hopefully apply it very readily to our own circumstances and have some time and space to reflect. So, oh, it's not working again. Oh, it is, okay. Hopefully it will pop back up. So this slide shows you what we want to look at today. So I want to talk about stress as a phenomena, why it's so important from an individual point of view, from an organisational point of view, from a societal point of view. And from the very outset, we will all have very, very different perceptions as to what this topic is, whether it's of relevance to us, whether we believe in it as a philosophy, as a construct. So, you know, in my work in consultancy and research over the years, I've heard people say things such as, I just don't get stressed. I'm just the sort of person I don't get stressed. And I hear other people who say, you know, well-being, stress, that's a load of rubbish. We don't need to look at that. So I would ask you to really reflect upon your own positionality, your own preconceived notion of what is stress, what is health, what is well-being. Do you think this is important? And I'm not here to tell you that it has to be important, but I am incredibly biased in that my background is in organisational psychology. So as a philosophy, we start from the point that well-being is everything. If you have an optimal level of well-being, whatever that might look like for you, you are going to be able to perform well. You're going to be happy. You're going to be healthy. And that in turn became a commercial discipline in organisational psychology because it has an economic output. It has a return on investment for organisations. So it's not a fluffy topic. It can be if you want it to be, but it's also rooted in really hard outcomes. And that's why this exists as a commercial entity across the globe. We've got lots of different ways of measuring stress, conducting stress audits, making sure that organisations from a legal point of view have a duty of care to make sure that the physical and psychological health of their employees are protected, because it drives fantastic gains in performance. And that's important in a generic sense, but it's even more important when we think about DBAs or any such activity where we are actively choosing to put ourselves through a really difficult experience. And we're doing that for a number of reasons. And it's important that we reflect upon the fact that doing so is quite challenging. And hopefully some of the content that we'll look at today, some of these things that you can see here, will help us to apply that knowledge to ourselves, whatever role we have. I'm also going to talk a little bit about boundaries and what those mean from a theoretical position, because there's different perspectives whether we integrate or segment different elements of our work and our life. There's also lots of philosophical exploration that we can have about whether doing a DBA or indeed any type of study, is that work? Is that life? Is it both of those things? Often in academia, we know that people work incredibly hard. They work long hours, but many people say, well, I love it so much that it doesn't feel like work. It sustains me. It's actually also a hobby. It's a bit of a calling, or a massive calling for many of us. And so that can be really difficult when we think about well-being, because equally rest, as we know, is super important. But when you're doing something you love, you've got to reflect upon whether that is in some capacity restful for you, or whether it is indeed another demand that's very, very hard to manage. So those are some of the debates and tensions. I'm going to share with you a couple of models and frameworks. You may be aware of them. There are many of them out there over the last sort of 40 or 50 or more years. As a topic, this has become quite broad and again quite nuanced, but feel free to completely disagree with the models and frameworks. They're only as useful as they are to you. So I'm not putting them up here and saying that they are the best way to go. They're just a selection of things that may or may not be helpful reflection points for us. So to get us started, I'm going to ask you just to spend a minute or two talking to the person next to you about these questions. What do you understand by the term stress? And under what circumstances do you feel stressed? I'm not going to force anybody to share anything in the full group. It would be great if people want to, but we have to recognise, of course, that this is a deeply personal and often quite sensitive topic. So have a minute or so, and then if we're comfortable, but maybe we can share some broad reflections. If you don't want to share any personal reflections, that's fine. I will share with you some examples that people have come across previously in our conversations. So have a chat, have a brief chat. Okay, so I'm sensing that people have got lots of examples to share about their experiences with stress. Would anybody like to volunteer any of their reflections to the full group? Anyone brave enough? Yes.
So I just thought about grounded theory, so we just did a grounded theory of what we are observing. The main concern is distinguishing between energizing stress and energizing joy.
Oh, interesting. Yes.
The problem is coming out, the answer to that, so the way to resolve that is a core category that emerges, and it seems to be early observing. So if you observe too late, you may go into a burnout.
Yeah.
Yes.
But if you observe early, then you may see those signs.
Absolutely.
There is
go on, sorry.
3 dimensions of observing: body, thoughts, emotions. Maybe more, we don't know, we haven't saturated our data.
Wonderful.
There was an antecedent of observing, which is allowing to observe.
Yes.
And then that's it.
Amazing, thank you. I think what you've pulled out there is something that I was going to share in the slides, which is this need to really allow yourself time and space to reflect, because we are so busy, aren't we, that actually what happens is stress often builds up very cumulatively over time, very gradually. Actually, you're feeling quite good, things are going well, things are busy, but good busy, we often say that. And then actually, before you know it, if you don't stop and pause and reflect, there's a tipping point that takes place. And that tipping point is very subjective. We're often not sure whether it's happened or not. But I like to liken it to the engineering term. You know, stress really originates from engineering. It's the exertion of a load upon an object. So if you think about a spring that's coiled very tight, if I exert a load on that spring and I pull it like this, and it's exertion, it's pressure, at some point that pressure becomes so intense that the spring snaps. And that can be quite a nice way of thinking, not nice, but quite a useful way of thinking about that tipping point over into burnout. I think there's another really fascinating dimension there, just overhearing some of the conversations. People say, well, actually, we really like pressure, but we don't like stress. And what's the difference between pressure and stress? Because we're all choosing, aren't we, to actually engage in quite demanding careers. We know this to be true, and we've decided at some point, hopefully we've decided to do that. We've made some conscious choice to do those activities. But oftentimes we might sit back and go, what on earth have I done? It's become too much. So there's an element of control that I think links with that as well. Would anybody else like to share any reflections, anything that they raised in those early conversations?
So my colleague said that she's stressed when she's expecting or meeting people's expectations. Okay, but for me it's different. It's when I have things to do with a limited time.
Absolutely.
Okay, so this is stress for me.
Absolutely.
Another thing is parenting. When taking decisions for somebody, for someone, and the consequences is not on me, it's on him.
Yes.
Okay, that's for me is stressful because I'm guiding him. So what he will face, it's based on my decision.
It's an incredibly big responsibility, isn't it? It's that sense of absolute responsibility. And then the earlier point that you made really is the true definition of stress. It's a subjective experience, but it's where the demands that are made of you exceed your perceived ability to cope with those demands. So there's a mismatch between what needs to happen and your ability to make that happen in time and of good quality. And that is such a common theme across doing a DBA, across any element of working in or outside of academia, because as we know, all of these issues are compounded by the fact that work has become deeply intensified and continues to be intensified. And you also, usefully pick up on this notion of different demands from different elements of our life and how the two come into conflict very readily with one another. It could be two or more, so it could be work, home, DBA, work, life, DBA, and you have to think about where all of that fits together. Perhaps one more reflection before we move on. Would anybody else like to share anything?
Well, maybe in conclusion, it's negative, but according to us, there is also a positive stress, and you mentioned that like a pressure that gives us the energy to
Absolutely.
Accomplish tasks and
Absolutely.
complexity that surrounds us.
Yes, and we seek that out as human beings. It's incredibly rewarding to perform and to do well and to achieve things, even though it's effortful. So I think that therein lies a really interesting dynamic of the sort of human condition, that actually we can be our own worst enemy if we're not in tune with what this means for us and how we balance that tension or that tipping point. So let's have a look at the theory. All of these things that come on this slide, and you've not seen them already, you have discussed in those examples given. So it's this idea of what is positive stress, what is negative stress. There's different terminology in the literature. Eustress is often termed positive stress and stress is bad stress. Some theorists suggest that all stress is fine, it's just badly managed stress that tips over into those negative consequences. But it's a physiological thing, and that's something that I think is really important from a scientific perspective. You can talk about the psychological side of things, you can talk about the physical side of things, but if you are encountering stress to a significant degree, it becomes all-encompassing, and it can be incredibly damaging to your physical and psychological health. But then we think about, okay, well, is stress inevitable? One of the questions we often ask people, is stress inevitable in modern organisations, in modern life? Is there an inevitability that this is happening to us, that we'll always have those experiences of where our demands are high and our perceived ability to meet those demands is not where it needs to be. And so there's a lot to be said for how we then cope, because idealistically, one would suggest that what we need to do is remove the source of stress for people. But that's hard. So I'll give you an example. We did a lot of work in the emergency services. So if you're working in the police, or if you're working in an accident and emergency department, in a trauma unit, in a hospital, or if you're working as a firefighter, it doesn't have to be that significant, but this is a good example. You cannot remove the unpredictability from that job. You can't remove the high demands from that job. What you can do, potentially, is to equip people to cope in some capacity with that, and to ensure that there's appropriate support in place. But equally, stress management is both a personal and an organisational responsibility. So in the UK, under the Health and Safety Executives law, you have a duty of care as an organisation to protect the physical and psychological health of your employees. So you have to do stress risk assessments, for example, and you have to show that you are acknowledging this as a serious public health issue. But nonetheless, there's only so much an organisation can do, because individuals, as we know, they're often their own worst enemies. So your organisation, you could have a very supportive manager, but you might still go home and work very long hours. You could have an organisation that gives you a gym membership and fruit baskets every day, but you might go home and drink a bottle of wine and smoke cigarettes, or you might engage in unhealthy coping. So what we need to try and advocate for is stress and well-being as a shared responsibility between the organisation, or in this case, thinking about the DBA, a supportive, fantastic umbrella, if you like, that wraps around individuals and gives them that support and that compassion, but that equally as individuals we have to take some ownership of our own well-being as well. This is just to explain that stress can become all-encompassing. So if you are feeling stressed, and it's a very, very personal feeling, isn't it, that when it gets to its sort of dizzy heights of cumulatively building over years, it can become very, very damaging, and it can mean that it impacts upon many areas of your life and your inability to cope with it. Just want to sort of talk about well-being and stress. Often in certain literature spaces they are interchangeable terms, and in many they're not. Well-being potentially is a more holistic construct, if you like, that looks at quality of life across different dimensions. This is just one such model. There are many of them. But what's really interesting here is that well-being is often framed in terms of whether our needs, the extent to which your needs are being met. So are your needs being met in work? Are your needs being met in your personal relationships? Do you have the ability to feel sort of safe and secure, connected to others? Various different things that you can see. We also have a number of psychological resources, and that's something that can be quite helpful to reflect upon. Because many of the stress theories, as we will see, have moved to understand the individual differences that operate when we're looking at stress. So, for example, we could take 2 DBA students, we could put them in exactly the same situation. They could have exactly the same sort of career. They could have exactly the same prior knowledge, experience and skill. One of them may thrive, the other may crumble and find it incredibly difficult. So there are individual differences that operate between sort of the things that can cause us stress and how stress manifests itself in terms of outcomes. And it can be helpful to have a look at what some of those things can be. So we'll do that in a moment. But just to set the seed, I've mentioned this already, I would ask you throughout the DBA process, whether you are a supervisor, whether you are a student, to have some time and space, and this is a perfect example of a situation where we can do that in a formal workshop. But throughout the process, have some time and space to reflect, because often, and you alluded to it in your comments, we are so busy that we just continue on our hamster wheel almost, don't we? We just continue and continue and we don't stop and think about what we need to do to look after ourselves until it becomes a little bit late. So I just wanted to introduce this concept of critical reflective practice as something that you can do informally, or for some students that we've supervised, as part of a sort of formal part of their thesis, they like to include, for example, a reflexive log about their positionality in the process of doing a DBA. What were the difficulties in how they managed that? How can you share that with other students so that they can learn about strategies that you might have employed to overcome some of those difficulties? Because much of this is often invisible. And I think it's really important as supervisors that we feel able to explore this topic with our students, and vice versa, so that our students can understand perhaps that we equally might be stressed with our workload or our work-life balance. So there's a bigger picture there surrounding how we have those conversations, because when you're working on your own on a PhD or a DBA, it's a lonely process. Now, you will have incredibly supportive relationships with your supervisors if you're a student, and your supervisors, you know, you'll be well versed at talking with your students about potential challenges. But often, I think there's still a fear around exploring this topic. So what we want to try and do today is say, okay, we are reflecting naturally all of the time. You've just done it in deconstructing your experiences of stress. But what we can do is move towards this sort of reflective practice space where we use some frameworks and models, which we'll have a look at in a minute, and that can help us better make sense of our own well-being and stress. And of course, feel free, they may not be useful to you. You might like one of them more than the other. Some of it you might think is absolute nonsense, perfectly fine. Let's critique them. But hopefully there are some tools and techniques that can allow you just to reflect a little bit and organise your thoughts about your own experiences of stress during the DBA. I've already explained this, but in the UK, these are UK statistics which are published by the Health and Safety Executive, which is part of our government. It's a regulatory body that protects health and safety at work. We have a massive problem globally with work-related stress and its impacts on longitudinal health outcomes. So you can see here some statistics. 17 million working days are lost due to work-related stress, depression or anxiety in 2021-22. So obviously this is a massive economic impact. So it's a topic which is deeply important on a personal level, but then more broadly it's important for a societal level. I think what's really important is that we give some time and space to reflect upon doing a DBA in a capacity whereby you are also working in a very demanding role, because you're starting out from a position where demands are high already and you're adding another layer. Now, yes, it's a part-time programme. Yes, you will receive fantastic support. We have seen over the last 2 days the most fantastic celebratory examples of how people complete this programme. People's completion rates are super high, which is brilliant. And I would suggest they're super high because there's a really supportive organisational culture and climate which allows people to have open and honest conversations about some of these things. So these are really reflection points that we can explore. We know that work's demanding and stressful. You've got probably quite, I would imagine for most of our part-time, currently we have a lot of part-time PhD students who work full-time. And most of them in very senior roles, they have quite a lot of flexibility in their working lives, which is brilliant because it allows them to move between those different spaces with comparative ease compared to somebody who had a much more inflexible schedule. But nonetheless, flexibility brings with it its own problems when you try and think about how you manage, for example, the demands of childcare. I know you've talked about that. Because you're not able to segment the different areas of your life in the way that you might like to. They all sort of blur into one, and that can become quite overwhelming. So it can be helpful to think about potentially what can we do to further our understanding of that. I also think, as I said earlier, that much of this feels very private, still feels very uncomfortable to people. The opposite of being stressed at work or in any element of your life is thriving. And the two are sort of deeply intertwined in many ways, as we've seen from the beginning, in that we want a certain amount of stimulation and pressure. And there's still a sense of shame which we find when people admit that they're struggling. And I have seen this with students before, in that people often only tell you that they were struggling perhaps 6 months or a year after the event. So even if you've got really supportive relationships, you can see in some students that they still don't want to disclose a difficulty in terms of their well-being. And that can be really hard. It can be really hard to keep to yourself, and it can also be really hard from a supervisor perspective to know when to push a little bit to try and get a disclosure or to try and support. So those are challenges as well. And what I think is really important is this notion of role modelling, because things can be hard, but they can also be very fulfilling. So it's something that can occur almost mutually at the same time if we acknowledge that things are difficult. So I think what's really important is giving people a realistic preview of how hard things can be in academia and to normalise that. So, for example, paper rejections. We don't often see the rejections, they're hidden, they're invisible. We just see the successes when people share their wonderful achievements, and actually normalising the fact that these things are difficult. And if you've got very senior professors that are doing that, I think it's really potent in helping people equate that to understanding the dynamics around well-being. So there's this visibility that needs to be heightened sometimes in order to try and eradicate some of that stigma. But boundaries are really important, and they are increasingly difficult given those demands. And I often feel uncomfortable when I'm giving sessions like this, because people always expect me to say, what is the solution? And, you know, there isn't one. It's hard, and there's different tools and techniques that can help, but there's no perfect way of being able to overcome all of these challenges. But I think that idea of reflecting and having that time, creating those supportive environments and climates that allow us to explore this are super, super helpful. And we mentioned earlier, if we had more time, we could talk about this, but I would urge you to reflect upon doing academic work or doing practitioner-oriented academic work. Is it work? Is it a hobby? Is it fun for you? How do you conceptualise it? It's still a demand, isn't it, even if you enjoy it? And that can be quite a difficult thing to reconcile. There's lots of work, and I've got some papers at the end for you, there's lots of work that summarises the sort of blurring of boundaries between home and work and how we might integrate those, how we might set rules for ourselves that help us to manage those different dimensions in a way that keeps them separate. And I think when you're doing a DBA, it's all consuming, isn't it? Because there's always something you could be doing on it until it's finished. And if you're doing the work at home, and then you've got work, and then you've got home life, and you might be sat in your dining room or your lounge of an evening on your laptop, you've got to perhaps reflect upon whether that works for you or whether that feels in some way intrusive. So some people like to integrate those separate areas of their life. They find it helps them optimize their well-being. And other people feel that some segmentation, so keeping everything very much contained within a physical boundary, such as having an office where you do your DBA work, you don't have it spread all over your dining room table, can be for some people a really helpful way to compartmentalize. But for other people, it will feel much more comfortable to let it flow into every domain, and that's a sort of physical space domain and also potentially an emotional domain as well. So there's loads of fascinating dynamics, and my message really is to explore these. So as a supervisor, explore this with your students. As students, reflect upon it and have conversations with your supervisor. There are thousands, probably thousands, might be exaggerating, hundreds of stress models and frameworks. And I want to just give you a summary, because I think this is super interesting. And I've also got an example of a toolkit that we can do to explore something in a little bit more detail. So what you can see in this, hopefully, in this model is on the left-hand side, and I'll just talk you through it. We have what are called stressors. So they are things out there in your environment that can cause you to become stressed. So they could be demands, we've mentioned it. Most popular one, having too much to do. Demands, they could be control. We know that a massive stressor, thank you so much, thank you. A massive environmental stressor is a lack of control over how you work, not having enough control over what you do and when. Support, super important. If you don't have any support from your manager, your leaders, from your supervisors, if support is low, that's a source of stress. Relationships, huge. So much information about this in the workplace. Relational stressors, conflict, difficult conversations, abusive behaviour at work, discrimination at work, bullying and harassment. They are massive things that can create stress. And then how change is managed, how we respond to change, how change is communicated, career development opportunities, if they are poor, if they're unfair, if there's an inequity, and then the homework interface. All of those things are potentially things that can cause you stress. We then have, on the very right-hand side of the screen, stress outcomes, and they are consequences of stress. They are things such as poor physical and psychological health, digestive issues, problems sleeping, anxiety, all of those different things. In the middle of those two, so this used to be seen as a sort of input-output situation, but in the middle of those two things, we know that there are massive individual differences. So as I said earlier, I could put you both, two people, exactly the same job, exactly the same situation, somebody could thrive and somebody could crumble. We know that there are individual differences, moderators, lots of them, contested and debated, that you can explore. We also cope very differently to one another with stress. We have go-to coping mechanisms, and most people do not choose healthy coping mechanisms. So healthy coping would be things like seeking psychological support, talking with friends, sharing your issues, exercising, getting outside, having a break, getting away from your screen. All of those things would be healthy coping mechanisms. Unhealthy coping mechanisms would be things like not disclosing that you're struggling. They would be things like drinking excessive alcohol, eating unhealthy food, not getting enough sleep, not doing exercise, or struggling to disclose when things are challenging. This? Potentially, yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that is really important is that notion of control, isn't it? So before, I went out for an hour at lunchtime and I thought I'd take the metro to the old town, just have a quick, it's one stop, it's great. I had plenty of time, I came to get the metro back, and the metro is finished because it's shut, there's an accident and it's not possible. So you suddenly think, gosh, I might be late. It's the same with traffic, if you're stuck in traffic, it's not within your control, there's nothing you can do. So it's hard, isn't it? But yeah, absolutely, technology and our interactions with technology creates a tremendous amount of stress. Wow. Thank you so much. I'm not going to touch anything. So the idea is that in the middle, as I said, there's lots of different individual factors, some psychological, that can help to bring about a more positive outcome, that can buffer, if you like, these things if we can't remove the source of stress. Of course, idealistically, the Health and Safety Executive in the UK says, if these things go well, you can measure them, there's tools, you can measure these, you can have self-audit tools, really nice way of trying to make sense of what's happening. If you can remove those sources of stress, absolutely remove them, that's the first thing to do. If you can't, you need to turn your attention towards those individual differences and try and optimise those so that you can minimise the damage. So on the right-hand side of the circle are difficult consequences, as we've mentioned. There are loads of other models that I think are a useful way of understanding this link between positivity and negativity, which we mentioned over here at the beginning. So the job demands resource model seems to have, in the UK, been a very prominent model for the last, 20 years almost now. The idea is that you've got two conflicting things. You've got demands that are placed on you on the top. So they could be things like shift work, time pressure, workload, horrible relationships. And then you've got resources, and these are positive things. So the idea is we need to optimise these. And if we have good resources, so if you get decent feedback, if you have rewards for difficult experiences, if you do have those higher levels of control, if you are listened to, if there is a respect at work, if you've got support, then what's going to happen is that your chance of burning out and exhaustion is going to be lower. So these resources help to buffer the demands. If you've just got the high demands but absolutely no resources, you're going to suffer. You're going to suffer those consequences. And the opposite of exhaustion is engagement or flourishing or thriving at work. And that's what we want to be able to create. We want to try and think about how you can thrive within your DBA and, of course, in your broader working lives. So what I thought might be nice is to introduce this concept to you. We've literally got about 7 minutes left, and I want to sort of leave you on this note. Type A behaviour is a really interesting construct. Before we start, has anybody heard about this before? Yes. Of people. It's heavily debated, and what I want to do is introduce you to it by asking you to completely privately this very short Type A behaviour. This is the Bortner Type A, and it allows you to score yourself along a number of dimensions. You give yourself a score. You've got opposing polarised scale. So the first one, for example, is whether you're casual about appointments or never late. So somewhere along that scale, you can have a go at doing this. You're welcome. There we are. There we go. To there. To there. Now again, with anything like this, I would always urge you to critique it. I'm not saying it's going to be useful. It might be something that helps you reflect a little bit. You might find it not especially helpful. You might think these things are good. You might think these things are damaging. But effectively, you can give yourself a score across each of those, add them up, and we'll see where we get to. So when you've finished, not to rush you, of course, there's plenty of time. You can add up your scores, and you should be able to then ascertain whether your score is over 84 or under 84. That's the sort of key metric that we're looking for. And as you are completing that, I will tell you a little story about what Type A behaviour is all about. Now, in psychology and related disciplines, people like to disprove one another's theories all of the time, and since the creation of this notion in the 1950s, I believe, it has been, you can read about it if you're interested, there's been a really interesting sort of debate about whether this is a personality trait, whether it's behavioural, whether it's something we can change over time. I've completed this. I first completed it when I did my master's. It was given to me in a session about stress management. My PhD supervisor, Lynn Davidson, encouraged us to do this in our stress management session. And I was Type B then. My score was quite low. It wasn't Type A. But recently, in the last sort of 10 years or so, my score is much higher. So, two cardiologists, Friedman and Rosenman, in the 1950s, they weren't psychologists, they were working, as the story goes, in a cardiology clinic. They were medical physicians. And what they noticed amongst the predominantly male patients that sat in their waiting room was that they all displayed similar characteristics behaviourally to one another. They were rather impulsive, they were rather impatient, they might sit and jiggle their leg, they couldn't sit still, they were very competitive. There were these traits, and they also observed that these individuals were suffering from heart complaints. So it's very interesting, and what it suggests is that this is one potential trait that we can show, and being very gentle here, because since there has been research to suggest that it's a helpful way of looking at whether we are pushing ourselves in certain ways, but it can supposedly have an impact on our physical health. So if we are very strong type A, if our scores are towards this over the 84 mark and towards the 154 mark, we might be more likely to be putting our bodies under undue strain, and that we might be likely to suffer some ill health consequences as a result of that. So put your hands up if you score over 84 and you are type A on this measure. Yeah. Every time, as I've done this for about 15 years with lots of different student groups, part-time master's students who are all working as sort of HR directors, and in every room, in every single room, we normally find between 80 and 90% of our students and our staff and our people that we're talking to have this type A behaviour trait. And it's thought to be potentially something that can increase our likelihood of feeling physically in a very stressful zone. So it's just something to think about, something to reflect upon. Again, feel free to critique the construct. But in the work setting, this is what type A's may do. It might be very difficult to segment different areas of your life. It might be very difficult to rest. Now that can also equate to feelings of satisfaction, of course, if the work that you're doing is a joy. You know, we mentioned before this notion of joy versus work. But we might work very long hours. We might impose very tight deadlines. We might not take our holidays. We might cut our holidays short. We might really push ourselves to meet deadlines which are challenging or problematic, and we might feel really frustrated when other people around us don't behave in the same way that we do at work, and that can be really interesting. I also think it can be quite a useful thing to reflect upon in terms of the dyad between student and supervisor. So often you might find that a supervisor might be very type A and their student might be type B, or indeed vice versa, and that can have some interesting dynamics for how you explore the relationship. So that's just one example of a potential psychological difference between us that can impact upon how we experience stressors and how they link to consequences for our physical and psychological health. I also want to point this out because it's something that I think we'll probably finish on in a moment, but this idea that actually we want this level, we mentioned it in all of your examples, we want this level of optimal stress. And that is a balance, it's balancing tensions to reach that sweet spot where we feel very stimulated, we feel that we're achieving a very important goal, but we're doing so in a way that isn't tipping us over into this overload state. So what researchers have done over the years, they've said that equally being underloaded is as stressful as being overloaded. So if you're in a job, we often see this in graduates, in very bright graduates when they haven't been able to get decent jobs. They are overqualified for the job, they are underemployed. So you've actually got underload, quantitative in terms of not enough work to do, and qualitative in terms of work being too easy for you. That can equally be very stressful. So it's quite a nice, again, tool, I would argue, to ask yourself, what does the optimal stress look like for me currently? What's happening in my work life? What's happening with my DBA? How can I try and balance things so that I am in this part of the graph? Yes.
We had an interesting discussion because it's captured by the spring.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
you push down. And the problem is you're in optimal stress, but maybe at the border, and the yellowish is creating that string and that pressure, but you're still in the optimal stress, so you don't know if you're going to spring back.
Yes,
and you don't
yes.
see the burnout coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's
How do
often
you capture that moment?
there's often no way of knowing, is there? Because sometimes you can surprise yourself and you can feel very close to something bad happening, but then actually you suddenly feel fine again. So it can be really difficult. I think it's about engaging in that reflective practice and trying to recognise what those things look like, trying to discuss those challenges with people, trying to find ways of supporting yourself, creating time, creating rest. But yeah, it's hard because there's no one size fits all, because what optimal stress looks like for one person will be very different to the next. So, if you think about people here, we have, entrepreneurs in the room, people who thrive with a much higher degree of stress than most people would like. So yes, it's very subjective, and that's the key. Just to finish again, I'm forced to finish. No, that's okay. There's things that you can do to think about how you cope with work and with life. Do you behave in a way that is adaptive or maladaptive? And just to think about your boundaries, and I will leave it there, that you only have so much resource. Elaine mentioned this morning, you only have so much time. Think about how to use your time wisely. We can't buy time, we can't create it, it's very difficult. So I'll finish there. Thank you everyone, I hope it's been in some way useful.